Buying a home can feel overwhelming, especially when you're not sure who to trust. Lane works as your advocate in the mortgage process, helping you understand your choices and avoid costly mistakes. From first time buyers to homeowners looking to refinance, his goal is simple: help you make the right move. Call or text Lane at 618-671-1830 to get started. Again, that's 618-671-1830. NMLS number 2413537. Edge Home Finance, NMLS number 891464. Equal housing lender. Now on to the episode.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Particular Baptist Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Vincent. You can find us and other podcasts at reformpodcast.com. Also, check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. If you would like to support the ministry, a great way to do that is by joining our army of patrons at patreon.com/theparticularbaptist, where you can receive perks for being a member of one of the three tiers, and it's a great way to support the ministry and be part of kind of that in community, if you will, surrounding the Particular Baptist. So head on over to patreon.com/the Particular Baptist and sign up for one of those tiers. All right. So diving into our topic today, I wanted to take a look at kind of a discussion more on trends, I guess, than any particular theological topic. I want to talk about confessionalism and its growth. And I guess maybe more I'm thinking about this over the past 5 years, thinking about this now. Has confessionalism seen, well, I guess it would go beyond that too, but has confessionalism really seen growth in among confessing Christians, or is it more of a perceived growth? And I think this is a nuanced discussion because there's a lot of things to consider. I don't think it's as straightforward either way. I think there are reasons for it to be considered growth, and maybe reasons to not be considered growth based on some different factors that might come up. But I do think that what we find in kind of these confessional type circles is a lot of appearance of growth and actual growth, but I think there might be some what I call disjointed confessionalism that we'll talk about as well. But when we're talking about confessionalism, this would be this isn't just a Christian or a church that is confessing a statement of faith. While we could rightly say that a statement of faith found on a church website is a confession in some sense, I'm thinking about adopting a formal Reformed confession, like the Belgic Confession or the Westminster, the Savoy, the Second or First London. Those formal confessions of faith that are considered part of the Reformed stream. And so, and I'm not talking about, I don't count the New Hampshire in there. We've done an episode on the New Hampshire, and we don't think that's a Reformed confession. It's just some neutered, I guess, 1689, but we wouldn't even count it as a Reformed confession. I'm talking about those confessions that are considered part of the historical Reformed faith. Okay, and again, there are kind of some that are primarily, and there's also fringe ones, if you will, or early ones like the Second Helvetic Confession. But those are all confessions in the Reformed stream, historically speaking. They were big. They represented the kind of the consensus views of each particular group, and representing those core Reformed fundamentals, right? Like on worship, on God, on salvation, things like that, right? Covenant theology at a very basic level. They all agree on those things. So there is, I'm talking about this from a historical Reform perspective. So we do see, I think, some growth in confessional standards. Okay, I think there are confessional standards um, that have been more adopted. You see people quoting these historic confessions or places from one or more of those historical confessions. You see a callback for recovery of historical confessionalism, that we need to go back to having confessions as kind of our guardrails on what we believe about scripture, and having a proper understanding of like sola scriptura, right? Having a proper understanding. There's also been a greater discussion on federal theology. What do we believe about covenant theology? There's been books that have been published on that in recent years, specifically talking about it historically speaking in Reform theology among particular Baptists, even among like you have R. Scott Clark, who talks about it from the broader Reform perspective, and emphasizing those things more and calling back to a more confessional understanding. And he's a United Reform guy, so he is um, he comes from the Belgic Confession, the Heidelberg Catechism, and the Canons of Dort. But there's that, again, that common stream there. There's been a lot of discussion on covenant theology, on federal theology, especially among Baptists. You see this push for it, and tying that back to a confessional history, not just saying, well, this is what the Bible teaches, but also saying, well, here's historically what was taught on these things, and this is why we should emulate those biblical things found in history, right? If you believe in this confession, here's the historical stream that this finds itself in. Okay. So there's been that. There's been more commentaries on confessions themselves. There is a discussion. I can't remember who wrote it. If it was Van Drunen, it was a Presbyterian person coming out with a commentary on the Westminster. I have a copy of it somewhere around here. And then, of course, you have multiple commentaries on the 1689 Second London. Waldron has two or three editions of of his commentary. You have Renahan's commentary, and then there's at least one other. I can't. The man's name is lost on me. But the point is, you have this recovery and this renewal and zeal for confessionalism that you just didn't see maybe 30 years ago, or maybe even 20 years ago, where it was like, okay, we're Reformed Baptists, we're Reformed, but what does that mean? A lot of that was interpreted through the lens of a modern understanding of these things. And then you had guys, like the Renahans, who went and mined a lot of this old material. Some of it meant going to England or going to the United Kingdom and going to these old dusty libraries and getting these documents out and reading them and documenting them for us. So there has been this recovery, and I think this growth in confessionalism, at least from the academia part and in the church, where people are realizing that confessionalism is important. So that, there's the confessionalism aspect of it, and then just the general church history part. I think people have been more zealous about church history, and especially now that there's been greater access to materials online, that you don't need an uh, academic access to get to. You can just go and Google if you know what you're looking for, and you just can find much of the stuff free online or cheap to purchase, right? So there's just been so much in general that has allowed the layman to be able to access the history, the primary sources, and all the stuff relating to confessionalism, that I think has started to settle in people's minds. It also means there isn't really an excuse anymore for not having a robust confessional understanding. If you say I'm Reformed Baptist, you can't claim ignorance anymore on doctrines, on understanding what people said about major topics, right? It's just not something you can get away with anymore, right? Now we can go read William Kiffin. Now we can go read Hans Ernaux. Now we can read Keach. It's accessible, right? And it requires you to read. It requires you to do the work, but you can do it. Okay, what did Benjamin Keach believe about the church? Okay, I can go look up the glory of a true church online and read his church polity, and have an understanding of what was going on at the time. So I think confessionalism, it's been seen as an important topic that needs to be discussed. It's something that needs to be addressed, and I think that people have started to have that settle in. And again, I think from a historical perspective, doing that has made it so people are without excuse when it comes to understanding a solid, robust confessionalism, and it helps to weed out a lot of the misunderstandings, mischaracterizations, and silliness that you would find in modern reform settings, where they could get away with those things before based on the information they have, but now they can't. And so when challenged, now you have to rethink maybe 20, 30 years of history or doctrine that you've taught because it's been based on bad information. So that's happening too. And so it kind of leads to my next point about disjointed confessionalism. When we're talking about, you have this resurgence, but you also have this discrepancy between what is confessed versus what is practiced. And I think that you start to see that you've seen that more in the past 5 years with the doctrine of God discussion coming out. And I think people realizing that their understandings of these things have been wrong, and that they've been claiming I'm holding to a confession that says something different than what I thought it said, right? And some have accepted that and gotten on board with the historical reality of those things, and some have just continued to live a contradictory life and confess, oh yeah, I'm confessional, but I also hold to this thing that fundamentally contradicts it, right? So, putting 1689 in your bio is popular, but do people really understand these things as they are presented historically, right? Is this what the writers of this would have understood? And of course, understanding what the writers of these confessions understood is important to understanding what it means and what I'm actually associating myself with. If I confess the faith and say, I believe in this confession, I need to know what it is that they meant by it. Now, that doesn't mean I have to overanalyze everything that is said. I think some things are more plain than others in the confession. But things that are pretty plain are contested. Again, the doctrine of God was the one, and I Exhibit A with Jeffrey Johnson. We dealt with him. We've dealt with him extensively on the show with both of his books, the Failure of Natural Theology and his other book that came out on God that we did. The title escapes me. But the point is, they try to wedge this stuff into confessionalism, and as we saw with Jeff Johnson with his new book, the historical, uh, the pathetic historical analysis that he provided, trying to make his view of God fit into the Reformed stream, is really is really interesting. Because we go to primary sources and things like that, right? Reading, recovering the actual history, not relying on what secondary sources say about these things, right? Because I have the primary source and go read what the people said, or go and do digging and try to find these primary source materials. And again, that's something that is relatively new that the layman can do, is go and pull those things out and do their own study and kind of correct these people who supposedly are academic, right? But and another example is the Divine Council discussion that we had, right, where you saw this Michael Heiser theology cropping up quite a bit in Reformed circles and making quite a bit of headway, until that crashed and burned recently. Thank heavens for that. Thank the Lord for that. Um, And we push back on that, but just that was another example of destroying confessionalism. you know there's a strong emphasis from that movement on, we're confessional, we're reformed, here's the confession we hold to, we're going to try and analyze this confessionally. But then they're holding to something that requires you to fundamentally undermine what they thought about those things and who God is, right? It had all these cascading effects that required you to fundamentally go against and deny that confession if you were consistent, right? So there is this, again, there's a discrepancy that creeps in, right? Because people, it it's pop. I think it's because it's popular to say I'm confessional, and they're trying to maintain a view of what they've held for a long time or what they've come to believe. But they also know if they continue to hold that view, it might mean they have to give up their confessional status, right? They don't want to leave the confessional camp, but they also don't want to leave the camp that apparently contradicts the confession, right? And so they try to morph them together and wedge the the outside teaching with the confession. And we've seen and demonstrated that that is laughably bad. It's bad history. Um, it's just inexcusable these days because, again, this stuff is readily available. You can go primary sources to figure that out. There's good secondary sources to help. It's just not excusable anymore. So while you do see a rise in confessionalism in terms of its adoption, the question, I guess, becomes, has that practically worked itself out to where people are now actually forming their theology based on those confessions, or are they just saying they're confessional based on bad preconceived notions they've had for years and allowing bad theology to creep in under that heading of confessionalism? And they're willing to hold contradictory doctrines at a fundamental level, where you can't be confessional and hold to whatever it is they're holding to. That is, I think, kind of the next issue that has to be dealt with. We've gotten people to confessionalism. People have been calling for that for years. We need to be confessional, need to be confessional, need to be confessional. Okay, great. People have gotten to that point. But now I think the next step is getting people to actually believe what their confessions fundamentally teach and put those things into practice. I think that is the next step. So I think while you do see a growth in confessionalism in one sense, I think in another sense you don't, because confessionalism is not just merely saying I hold to a confession, it's also believing it, right? At least substantially, that this confession is what I believe the Word of God to teach, and then it is carried out in practice. So I think that is really the next step that we have to take when it comes to understanding these things. We need to have a robust practice that follows what we confess. If I say I believe X, Y, and Z, I need to put that into practice, right? So my theology needs to be in line with that. That, I think, is what is missing, right? Especially, and I think, another theological topic that is tied to that is the political theology. Political theology, especially among Baptists, is a mess. It's an embarrassing mess, to be honest with you. And I think that that is an area that has seen more recovery in recent years, and there are guys who are trying to be more consistently confessional in that way in the Baptist circles. Presbyterians are still trying to figure that out too. It's not just the Baptists, but I do think that Baptists have in particular been pushing for a certain political theology for many years, and it's not dying easily now that more historical data has been made available on our confession and put together and put out there. There are there's pushback on that. So the practical aspect is what is really lacking, I think, in confessionalism, and that's really where it needs to grow, because once you have the confession coupled with practice, you have complete confessionalism. Because confessionalism is not just about believing a bunch of doctrines in chapters and paragraphs. It's about putting these things into practice so that we can glorify God. right? Saying this is how we glorify God because we believe it's found in this confession. That is robust, true, complete confessionalism. That is where we have to grow as Reformed folks, is having a, a robust practice tied to our robust understanding and adopting of these of confessions. And I hope that people will remain humble and um, be able to come to a realization of these things. And that's really what it's going to be. It's going to be humility. Are we humble enough to understand these things in a way that is do we are we going to be humble enough to change our views that we may have held for many years when we realize that they're not in line with what we confess, because what we say we confess, we say is biblical, so we should align ourselves with that, right? And I think that's where we're kind of sorely lacking, and we need to really push ourselves in that direction is in practice. Um, and I'm thankful that there has been, a lot of growth, and I think people are coming around and realizing this more and more, that we got to be consistent in this way. Um, one area I think uh, that has kind of shown the faultiness of not having a robust confessionalism is like in the broader kind of Calvinistic movement, that they hold to the five solas, so to speak, or so they say, but they don't hold to any Reformed confession. They're kind of MacArthurite, Phil Johnson people. They loosely hold to kind of the Reformed Calvinistic framework, but they deny covenant theology. They have very surface level understandings of the doctrine of God, and maybe things like predestination, election, um, but not in a confessional sense, which they're leaving out key parts of the picture, right? They just kind of take what they want throughout the rest. But as I think I may have talked about this before, these things are not disjointed. The 5 points of Calvinism is not just a 5 point system that you throw together and then you just say, okay, I'm a Reform guy, I'm a Calvinist. That's all tied to covenant theology. That's a covenantal framework, covenant of redemption, covenant of works, covenant of grace, all those things tied together in those 5 points. That's what holds it together. You can't hold to the 5 points and then throw out confessionalism. You undermine the whole system. And I think, having a proper understanding of what the concept reform means historically is important to this discussion. Um, you have the MacArthur's tribe of what I call dispensational predestinarians. That's basically what they are. But unfortunately, this is the kind of stuff that you find more often than not on the front lines of so-called Calvinistic circles. These are the guys you see defending the 5 points of Calvinism against the Leighton Flowers of the world, right? And then they get slaughtered. Um, this is why Leighton Flowers feels empowered the way he does, because he's dealing with guys like Chris Date, who we've dealt with on this show before as it relates to annihilationism. The guy does not have a reformed understanding of almost anything. But he calls himself a Calvinist while denying Christianity, basically. You can go listen to that episode on annihilationism. But again, it's this, we're loosely holding to the five solas without real substance, right? But then it's like you wonder why Leighton Flowers feels so empowered and why he slaughters these guys, right? He slaughters these people on the front lines. But it's because they don't have a robust confessionalism. They're not really grounded in the history of the doctrine they claim to hold to. That has a robust history. That has a robust um, apologetic behind it. These guys aren't reading Francis Turretin. They're not reading Calvin necessarily. They're not reading, the Westminster Divines and other major reform topics on this subject, and then they wonder why they get slaughtered, because they're not grounded in the foundations of what it is that they claim to hold. And Leighton can see that a mile away and picks that apart, right? They could run circles around him if they had just put your MacArthur Bibles down and read old dead guys who have figured this out 500 years ago. We're acting like we're reinventing the wheel every time we come to this stuff, right? We don't have to do that. But we have a confessional mindset. We grow in confessionalism where we have a confession, and then that confession is coupled with proper practice that's consistent with that confession at a fundamental level. Then we are going to have the ability to defend against guys like Flowers, because he's not the first kid on the block to do this kind of stuff, right? Church has been dealing with his kind of theology for a long time, and it's been put to bed. And we act like, he's such a major threat. No, he's a heretic who needs to be silenced. And, we're just giving him all the ammo in the world because we don't know what we're talking about. But having a robust confessionalism forces us to go and study the history behind the theology we believe, right? And so we come back armed and ready. Like, look, you're being a moron here, Leighton. Look, this has been done with 500-600 years ago. Look, they talked about. Let's talk through this. Here's what we talk. They don't do that, right? Leighton likes to pick on guys like Piper, right? Chris Date, guys who are not strong, not reformed in any stretch of the imagination, right? And that's representative of the Calvinistic circles, apparently, right? And he's not really dealing with the Turretons of the world and these other robust confessional, even people in Baptist circles. He's a Baptist from 500 years ago, 400 years ago. So, we gotta come back to being strong, robust confessionalists. It will help. It just helps in so many ways. It helps us to, to be able to defend the faith against those internally who will try to destroy it. Helps us to be better armed. It gives us encouragement. Gives us practical tools to live for God and to understand His Word, without having us to come and reinvent the wheel every time we come to the scriptures. Like, man, what is this? Well, let me see if this guy talked. Oh yeah, look, he did talk about that. Wow, he wrote a whole book on it. Okay, I'm going to read that kind of thing, So let's have a robust confessionalism. It's only going to help us. It's not going to hurt us. Does it take work? Absolutely. But it can only help us be better Christians, and only help us be more consistent with what we claim to hold to. If we claim to be Reformed, we should be robust confessionalists. We should be studying the history. We should be studying the theology. We should be embracing it and putting it into practice. So, anyways, that's my soapbox report for the day. I hope this has been helpful and encouraging. And Lord willing, we will be back next week for our normal round of programming. Take care. Thank you for joining the Particular Baptist Podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at The Particular B and subscribe to us on YouTube, where you can find more of our podcast content. Also, check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. And if you'd like to support our ministry, become a patron today at patreon.com/theparticularbaptist.